Welcome to A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy. We are a pay and reward consultancy supporting organisations of all sizes and sectors to take a fair and equitable approach to pay, communicated clearly and honestly to employees. In this podcast, we invite experts to discuss some of the most pressing issues in the world of HR, culture and leadership. We're keen to explore how we can all work to overcome and navigate these challenges. So, tune in to explore how you could create an environment where people don't just have to come to work, but want to.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of A Case of the Mondays. I'm your podcast host, Ramiz Kaleem, founder and director of 3R Strategy and author of the book A Case of the Mondays. And I'm joined today by Nick Skinner. Nick started his career after university in the UK at Ford Motor Company on their graduate program, and over the last 30 years has built up experience across different sectors: oil and gas, financial services, not-for-profit, and biotech. Throughout his career, he's always had a passion for the power of people and how they unlock business value. His last role was leading the people and workplace teams at global biotech firm Abcam through its sale at the end of last year to Danaher. I don't know if I pronounced that properly. Danaher?
That's right, yeah, got it.
During this, Abcam became a highly successful business with consistently high levels of revenue growth and transformed itself into a business with both a passion for its customers and its people. It was rated in the top 10 of Glassdoor's best employers in the UK for 3 years running. Nick, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you with us today.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Ramiz.
Well, so we worked together many years ago.
We did.
RSA, where I was in the reward team and you were HR director. And I guess I was partnering in different part of the business, so we didn't have as much contact then, but we probably had more contact when you were Abcam and looking at all the different initiatives and things you were doing there. And I guess, when you look at Abcam being recognized in the top 10 of Glassdoor's best employers in the UK, that I think is a big achievement. Because when, I remember many years ago, I was in the HR team and they were thinking about being in the top 100 best employers to work for. And a couple of people in the team said, well, do we really want to make it into that list? But what if we're 92? It's not going to look great. And I mean, I personally thought, well, it's great to be in that list, but this is not a top 100. To be in the top 10 for 3 years running is a massive achievement. Can you walk us through some of the key initiatives or policies you implemented that you think helped create such a positive workplace and led to you being recognized by Glassdoor?
Yeah, great, Ramiz, and happy to. And I mean, I think sometimes I just start by kind of the recognition things like Top 100 or Glassdoor, and they're useful for particularly internally and externally driving messages about the kind of company you are, but they don't often last forever as well. I think that's the other thing, and lots of organizations find, and certainly we found after a few years, it starts to, it doesn't always, you can't maintain it forever. And that's not meaning only you change things internally. It also means you start to just get more focused. So people start to perhaps make comments who are not employees, but they start to, make comments externally. So it doesn't last forever. Is what I'd start with. But I guess what it was just very helpful for us to really take some of the stuff we were doing internally and make sure that it was recognized externally. And Abcam, as most people who are probably listening to this or watching this podcast would know, is probably don't even know who the company is. And actually that was one of the major parts of why we really focused on the Glassdoor activity, was to help us build an external brand. But it actually did was take what we were doing internally already to make it a great place to work and then help us externally. But I just do a little, a minute on Abcam because it's kind of useful to understand the context, because actually this is not a people strategy on its own. It's a people strategy which is delivering our business strategy. So Abcam founded 26 years ago in the UK, developing and initially just selling antibodies that other people develop, but over time transforming itself to develop antibody and related products to researchers worldwide. Now, most people won't even know what an antibody was pre the pandemic. During the pandemic, we all became very intimately aware of what antibodies were and how they were really helping change humanity's healthcare. So Abcam develops and sells these worldwide, and certainly kind of beginning of this year had around about 1,700 people based largely a third between the UK, the US and China, and then teams in other parts of the world, Singapore, Australia and other locations. So a very global business, consistently high growth, delivering mid-teens revenue growth year on year, super profitable, and over probably the last 4 or 5 years, really reinvesting in making, continuing to deliver that growth. That led through to the acquisition by the Danaher Corporation last year, which was kind of the successful outcome of implementing that strategy. So that's a little bit on the business, and that growth is underpinned by having amazing, talented people who are really engaged in the business, who kind of bring their whole self to work. That idea of you hear a phone ringing, it's 6 o'clock on a Friday, that somebody's always there to pick it up and look after our customers, and that obsession with our customers, and that's what we were trying to create in the company, and all of the people, processes, policies, changes we made were really about reinforcing that to make sure we could sustain that level of growth and reach more customers around the world. And the customer base, just as a bit of data, is around about 800,000 to 1 million researchers around the world. So it's a really tiny slither of the whole world population. But if you go and talk to any of those researchers, and you mentioned the name Abcam, I talked to a relative, and when I said, "Oh, I'm working for Abcam," they're like, "Oh yeah, I've got your products in the freezer." So really, really well known within our particular customer base, but probably to the wide population, not known. What do we do? I mean, I'm probably going to do a total disservice to all the things we did, and if any of my old team are watching this, I apologise, I'll miss stuff out. But there's a whole load of things, and I guess I'm going to start in your space, Ramiz, and actually you and your team helped me at the very beginning around really making sure we built fairness and transparency into what we did, and pay systems, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. But benchmarking every role and then committing to pay within a range to our people. And that sounds like a really simple thing, but what we discovered in some of our countries was we were well off the market, and then we actually committed, and that with the exec team, which is we have to get our people to within the range we've committed in every market, and we did that. And then also kind of understanding why we were so far out in some of those markets, and dealing with maybe some of the leaders that we had in the organization. Totally obsessing about what our people thought is another kind of fundamental element of that. And most organizations will survey their people every year, and then they have wait 3 months, get a report, perhaps then HR will develop a plan, and off they go. But we didn't do that. We surveyed every month, 7 or 8 questions every month. One was always, would you recommend us as a great place to work? But the other questions were random, using an amazing tool called Peakon, owned by Workday. There are other tools available, I'm sure, but that was a tool we used, and our leaders got the report, got the data, and worked on it immediately. I guess another thing is ruthlessly communicating. If you take ourselves back to the days of the pandemic, we had a call every day with our people around the world, and I guess tells you kind of when it's working. One of the guys in our team in the west coast of the US said that his partner listened to our calls every day with him at home, because they trusted what we said rather than what they were hearing from the government or from the media outlets. So, but you have to kind of do that all the time. And the first thing we always thought about as an exec team was, what are we going to talk to our people about this? How are we going to share this? How do we get them involved? Because we saw them as, they're shareholders in the business, they own part of the company. They were the key for delivering to customers. They'd often been customers themselves. Therefore, you always had to obsess about that. You had to have great career paths for people, great development routes. You had to invest in their development. You had to identify talent. So all the other things you do. And then the bit that kind of often gets forgotten by HR people is have an amazing work environment. You have to have a physical environment that is going to bring the best of people and allows them to bring their very best into the workplace. So, making sure you invest in that. If you have a really, rubbishy environment that's kind of boxes everywhere and all, scuffed edges, then people will be lazy in the way in which they perform in their jobs. They're not going to be really making sure things are super duper and just right. So, we invested in incredible physical environments around the world. Every location got invested in and either relocated or completely revamped into kind of new space. As you're growing, you need more space to do that. And that's lab space, which has got to be incredible. Previously we had lab space which didn't have air conditioning, didn't have windows. I mean, the most critical part of your product development, whereas we're in dark holes. I mean, why do you do that? Why wouldn't you make them have the most amazing environments? They're creating these incredible products. So making sure you did that to kind of support your growth then, and it also helps you with great talent attraction because you bring them into a great environment. They're like, hey, I want to be part of this. Whereas when it's a pretty ropey place, they're kind of like, am I sure I want to join this organization? Is this for the long term or not?
Yeah.
So those are some of the headline things I'd be thinking about, and I'm sure we can dive into more of them as we go on.
And so one of the things you talked about was you ran these monthly surveys and asked a few questions.
Yeah.
Could you and I know you mentioned the would you recommend us a place to work for, but could you give an example of a question that you asked in one of these surveys? Because I think one thing that frustrates employees often with surveys is that they give their opinion, but there's no action taken, and they think, well, why did you ask me about this if nothing's going to be done? So do you have an example of a sort of question that you would ask in this and any changes that were made as a result of what people said?
And the key part in this survey, which I guess is different from others, is that this data goes live every month to leaders. Of as long as you've got more than 6 people reporting to you, you get that data the moment the survey opens. So, and the questions are randomized, so you answer all of them over a period of 6 months, but you don't all answer them at the same time. So, not everybody gets the same question. So over 6 months, a leader gets the full bank of questions and data, but won't get every question every month, because I think it's about, I'm going to say 70 or 80 questions in the bank. You're not going to get, if you ask them every month, nobody would take part. The key is short questions. And I'll give you a great example. Have you had a great conversation? Have you had a conversation about your pay? And was that a good conversation? Now, people would respond, and you rate it on the normal Net Promoter Score kind of ratings, 0 to 10, 9 and 10 being promoting, 7 and 8 being passive, and then the rest being a detractor. So you're rating it that, but also people wrote comments. So a leader gets that, and it rolls up as you become more senior. To the CEO and the exec team could see every leader's results and could see all the comments. And we had something like about a 94% participation, because your point is absolutely right. If people don't think something's done on it, then they won't bother taking part. But if your leader gets information that you're not having, in this example, great conversations about pay, they're getting that data, right? Their HR team see that data. The HR team will then go and look at it and say, hey, Nick, you're doesn't look like you're having great conversations about pay. What do we need to do to help you with that? Let's support you. Have you been on this having great conversations with pay course, which we had as part of our performance with purpose process? And you could do that immediately. So rather than waiting 3 months, waiting for the results, and that, if you're getting to see that, people would make interventions really quickly. So people therefore shared their views. And the longer term things you start to pick up as an exec team and the HR team, we pick those things up and work with them. But I mean, every time that survey went live, I can tell you the CEO and the exec team were immediately looking at what was going on and looking at the results and then saying, right, we need to do this I've looked at the results in the, let's say, in the R&D team, and my colleague who ran that, she would be in her team meeting that month saying, right, we've looked at it, what do we think we need to do about X or Y to kind of address that. So rather than big programs and HR teams, which is why people get cynical about surveys and don't take part, it drove action quickly and people knew that, and therefore they contributed and gave comments. And we were getting well over 1,000 comments, written verbatim comments a month, which means if somebody's taken the chance and the CEO read every single one of them and you could respond to them, and he would respond to them as most of the exec team would within their own teams, they'd intervene and respond as well. So, and that retained the anonymity. The individual didn't, unless they put their hand up and said it's me, they wouldn't know who the CEO was. The CEO never knew who he was talking to, but he'd always respond to them.
Okay, so was it is it a case of through the platform they were responding, or is it in a team meeting they would?
No, through the platform you can respond.
Okay.
And then people could respond if they wanted to, and they could put their hand up and say, hey, hey Nick, it's Jim here in Oregon. I'm happy for you to give me a call about this issue. So people could make themselves known. But equally, if they didn't want to, they didn't have to, and you could have a dialogue anonymously with them about what was on their mind, to protect their anonymity, but made sure you could really understand what was the issue, or challenge them equally. Sometimes people can write rubbish and they make assert something as a point of view with no fact, and you'd go back to them and say, look, hey, that's interesting, but that's not necessarily accurate. And I'm happy to have a conversation with you about it, but that's not accurate. And that kind of dialogue, I think, is what do they call it? In transactional analysis, adult to adult conversation rather than parent-child attitude. So that's what it drove. And if you can look at the data, I mean, on the Net Promoter Score question, which is would I recommend it as a great place to work? Back in 2016, when we first did a survey pre this platform, we were at -12 as a recommend it as a great place to work. And yeah, I think when I left, it's at 42 plus 42.
Wow.
So I think that's pretty amazing kind of score. And for customers, we're at sort of +50, +60 to customers as well, in terms of making sure we're delighting our customers, because it's the same thinking and the same kind of methodology we use with our customers, we use with our people.
Okay, and I think that links in well with what I can see sitting behind you. So is that your period at Abcam 2016
yeah, that was my period.
to 2024?
It was one of my gifts when I left. Was in the UK we have these lovely blue plaques that people put on the outside of buildings to say, hey, somebody famous lived here. I don't think I'm famous, probably infamous, but they were like, okay, we're going to give you this plaque when I was leaving, and it was wonderful to kind of be recognised and by your team. So it was by our wider team, in fact, that did it and gave it to me on my last day. So unfortunately, I haven't put it on the outside of my house, and I didn't put it on the outside of the building in Cambridge, but I do quite like it here. It reminds me of this amazing business I had a chance to be part of.
No, that's amazing. It's to have that recognition after, because in a lot of places when you leave, they're not always happy for you to leave, particularly because you've made such a significant change and improvements. But to get that recognition must be really nice.
It was lovely, and I left on the same day as our CEO. Is kind of natural when these acquisitions happen. It's kind of a natural thing, and he's based in the US but was in the UK on his last day, and we had a yeah, it's just lovely to be recognised. We had everybody in the UK site was in our atrium to say goodbye to us, and it was very emotional when you put yourself whole into it, and seeing these incredible people that you've had a chance to touch some of their lives, and then to be recognised like that was just magical. There's a great, if anybody wants to have a look, there's a great picture on my LinkedIn stuff of that last day. So it just makes me smile when I see it. So yeah.
Ah, so that sounds amazing. I remember seeing that picture when you posted it. Funnily enough, I've also got a little plaque behind me because I made a little joke last week
I
on
saw
my
that.
LinkedIn
Yeah, I saw that.
saying,
Weren't you recognised by your own team?
yeah, so I made this joke that when I set up the business, I was on my own, and every month I would recognize myself as employee of the month. And now there's a team, and I'm proud, but I also feel a bit left out. So, as a joke, my team got me this little employee of the month recognition, so I don't feel left out. So it's
Amazing.
not quite as amazing as your recognition.
No, I also saw you got online. You got a certificate as well from one of your teams. So I think they're generally trying to make you feel like you are recognised by them as well. So I think you do a
Yeah.
great job with your team. You've got an amazing team of people.
Yeah, no, the team is amazing, but I think they're all. This is all sarcasm. I don't think they really recognize me. um, so one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was, I've seen you post on LinkedIn about this, about inclusivity in the workplace, and one of the things that you talk about in particular, is about paternity leave. And so and I don't know if you heard recently in the US with SHRM, they changed their whole definition of diversity, inclusion and equity, and they took inclusion out of that definition, say that now they only call it diversity and equity, and inclusion was taken out. That did cause a lot of controversy, but I wanted to ask you how you would define an inclusive workplace, and what are some of the practical steps that, as a progressive HR function, you could take to foster that inclusivity, including things like paternity leave.
And I think this is, I think sometimes some of the DEI stuff gets confused along the way, and I'm lucky enough to kind of worked in some great organisations that piloted ideas on this, before it was kind of trendy. And I can even remember being back in the day when I worked at Ford Motor Company, where we were trying to get progression for ethnically underrepresented employees in leadership positions, and how are you going to get people from our frontline manufacturing roles where we have very strong diversity mix right the way through to into leadership roles, and how we help people through by giving extra education and really practical ways to kind of support people through that were underrepresented. And that's back in the 1990s. So I think there's lots of things that you can do along the way. And for me, it's about driving business performance. You want the very best people, don't you? I mean, you want the very best people. You want them to be totally engaged in your business. You want them to be advocating it to others so they come join you, and you want them to stay and have amazing careers with you. So I start from, it's a business driven thing anyway. But then it's really about how do you bring that to life. And I'm going to give you two things I think that I've seen at my time in Abcam that I thought were critical. And one was not very, it was innovative at the time, but kind of through the pandemic is interesting to explore, which is flexible working. And traditional flexible working, we all know, but we decided to do a study with the London Business School and one of the professors there on the impact of giving people freedom of choice on how they worked flexibly. And this isn't about your formal request process. This is about my week in work. So, how do I come in? And obviously not all of our roles were completely flexible, but actually quite a large number were. And we ran this study where we asked people, we effectively, it's kind of like the Matrix. We gave them on a Friday, like a green or red pill equivalent. But we said to them, hey, you're going to work as you normally work, which is predominantly at that point in the office, and you're going to work how you want to work. And that means you can work from anywhere. We don't care where. Up to you. In that course of that week, you can work from home, you can come in, you can go and work in a coffee shop. We don't mind. We don't care what hours you work. We're just going to get you to do what you choose to achieve what you need to achieve. So we did the study, and we did it over 5 weeks, and we had at the time around about 200 people a week taking part in that study. So roll it through 5 weeks, that's 1,000 data points. So it's a really good, rich data. And then on the end of that, we surveyed people, we talked to leaders, we surveyed leaders, we talked to the exec team, we looked at business performance. Now, what did that tell us? What it told us, it was absolutely blindingly obvious, but what it really told us with data, and in a scientific business, we need data. It showed us that if you gave people freedom of choice of how they operated, that they performed better. We had better business results that period of time, better sales. We hit every other target consistently. But what it showed us around on engagement was particularly people who had caring responsibilities, and disproportionately that falls on women as tradition has it in the study was in the UK. Then they had a disproportionately positive impact on them. But anybody who had caring responsibilities had an impact, and everybody benefited. No demographic had a detraction from it. Everyone had a positive experience of it, the freedom of choice. And what it also said to us was, when we said to people, is it just complete freedom to do what you want? It was like, no, we kind of need to be in the office because there's part of our life is around that connection. It's this whole debate about return to the office, I thought is a ridiculous kind of conversation. Actually, what you need to have is a balance between the two. And it's kind of, what we came up with back in the day, 2017, 18, was, 2 or 3 days in the office, 2 or 3 days at home. But you choose how to do that, because that freedom of choice was the most important thing. It wasn't the days. And actually then it gave you ability to kind of look after, and you work the hours you want to achieve what you need to achieve. It made you could look after kids, you could look after parents, you could receive your Amazon parcel that you need to receive, or deal with the kind of the guy that comes in to service the boiler, or whatever it is. Those things add stress to your life and take you away from being able to do an amazing job. For us, if you give you freedom, you can run your life to do that. So it had an incredible diversity impact, but by being open to everyone. And it was tested through the pandemic because that took away freedom of choice. We all went to home working. Luckily, we had all the tech. Having done this, meant we could survive that. And there were some people who, coming back into the kind of the norm, back into that way of working between the two, they found that hard because they were now keen on being at home all the time. But we equally had people who didn't want to kind of adopt it the other way around at the beginning. So it kind of, for me, that's a really great example of a very practical DEI based out of data, based out of research that created a great place to work. And it was freedom of choice, not place of work. That's the important thing. And the other one then, just you touched on, is family leave. And I kind of struggle to call it paternity leave, because actually families are quite complex and different today from the traditional ways. And but again, if you look at the burden of childcare sits with women, and our system reflects that. So, and if you look, and again in the UK, but in the UK, maternity leave, quite relatively generous, but paternity or parental leave is 2 weeks, 2 weeks paid, and in the US, in a lot of places, it'll be like 2 days, or none. And what we did is we introduced, we talked to our people, talked to our leaders, and we introduced consistent global maternity leave everywhere. And actually, again, in the US, our colleagues only had 2 weeks paid, and then they had some state, depending on their state, paid. We introduced that everybody went to the same 18 weeks full pay maternity. And then we introduced parental leave, shared parental leave, which would then turn to 6 weeks paid everywhere, with an aim of getting us to the equal across all of the locations over a 5-year period. We couldn't do it in one go, just couldn't afford it in our cost base, but we went to 6 weeks paid. And that was, we had people crying when we introduced it, with delight that we could do this. And no, again, you kind of think, do you have to fight the exec team to do that? There was a CFO banging the table. Absolutely not. In fact, one of the first people to go was one of our senior finance people who went on the paternity leave, as it were, the 6 week, and was one of the biggest advocates for it. So because it was a no-brainer that actually you're going to attract great people to come join you, because by doing that, you're starting to address that the childcare burden always sits with women. Actually, it should be shared, and then you're practically starting to address some of that DEI issues that you kind of touched on.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because I have seen some really large companies introducing generous family leave, but like you said, in the vast majority of cases, because we do benchmarking and on benefits and all this sort of thing, it is very much 1 to 2 weeks leave. And I mean, what you mentioned about your US office, that is a massive change to move from 2 to 18 weeks.
Yeah.
So that must have been really well received.
Incredibly well received. And as I remember, we were, myself and the CEO were in the US, in our site in Boston at the time, and when we introduced it, when we announced it, and that's where we had like some of the most emotional response, positive emotional response. And but it was about being consistent. I mean, one of the things we drove was global consistency, where we could be consistent, because actually that's important, because the business ran on a very global basis. It wasn't a regional business. Most of it was very connected globally. So you'd always be working on teams with people in China, in Australia, the US, the UK, the Netherlands. You couldn't. For us as a team, we wanted to be as consistent as possible, because in a relatively small business, 1,700 people, you kind of want to run things as consistently as possible for cost, and for just being consistent with your team. And sat in a team and one person getting 2 days off and one person getting 2 weeks off doesn't feel right, because that happens to be the local minimum. We didn't want local minimum. We wanted to stand out and be different. And we found it really helpful with kind of talent attraction and bringing both men and women into our workforce, because they kind of were like, wow, that's an amazing benefit.
Yeah. I can completely relate to your first point around flexible working as well, because it's something that I wanted to do from the start. And initially I was obviously on my own, and and it's very difficult to get projects when you first set up on your own. And one of the additional challenge that I had was, sometimes I would get a project and the company would say, okay, so when are you going to start coming into the office? And I would say, oh, I'm not coming into the office. I'm delivering this project for you. And I would lose a project because they wanted you to physically be there. And this is pre-pandemic, and obviously Abcam was the exception. So, again, I visited your offices in Cambridge, but most of it was just done remotely, and it was that trust of, as long as the work is being delivered, it doesn't matter where you do it or when you do it. And that now goes to the rest of the team as well. So we have that same sort of policy. So we actually don't have a physical office. Everyone is based remotely, and then we meet on a quarterly basis for the whole day. What is your view also around, well, actually, before I get to that flexible working in some ways, I guess, then set you up, or you were more prepared for the changes that were taking place during COVID, because all of these other organizations were starting to make a shift.
Yeah.
say, okay, we need to manage this. Do you think that helped with
Yeah.
the growth that you had at
Yes,
Abcam?
certainly did. And it was really helpful to have ourselves set up to be able to work that way. And with a global team, you have to anyway, because I mean, ultimately, you can't all be in the office together. Because I had colleagues sitting in Shanghai or Hangzhou or in San Francisco or in Boston. You can't. You're never going to be in the office. One of the things I think it really helped us work out was um, actually about democratizing people who were remote. I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah.
I guess like if you're sat at, you're sat in the on a Teams call in San Francisco, and there's 6 people in a room in Cambridge. It's kind of often difficult to get your voice heard in an equal way, and I think what the pandemic helped us really transform was moving to working out you didn't have to be like that, and actually you could have a more inclusive way of hearing voices that were remote, and it really helped us hone that when we were there. But the tech all worked. People were used to managing people remotely. So going into it actually was relatively straightforward in terms of making that all work. I think coming back in, there was all this noise about, oh, everybody's going to move to remote working, and we had a couple of people who like upped sticks and moved their families. We had somebody who was in Boston and moved to Colorado. We had somebody in the UK who moved from Cambridge to Newcastle, and then told us they had, and then they said, "Oh, I'm not coming in anymore." And you're like, that's not what our policy says. Let's go through. Have you got a formal request? No, I just want to live somewhere cheaper. I'm like, well, we all want to live somewhere cheaper, but we kind of have a way of working, which is 2 or 3 days in, 2 or 3 days at home. That's our way, and part of our, that's what research said drove higher performance, and what most people wanted. So, totally flexible. We don't have to do 2 or 3 days every week. We said, hey, why don't you come back and come down for a week, and then perhaps you're not back for another couple of weeks, and that's okay. But I think it was relatively straightforward for us. I think the change back, and we actually went round. I think it's probably about a year post-pandemic. We did some more research with our people, and I went round and interviewed and asked them about what they thought we should do, and we came back to actually what we decided back in 2017-18 really still worked, which was manage people on outputs. Let them make the choice about how they work, but we expect people to be in the environment, unless they're a remote worker, which we had some, then we expect them to be in the office environment 2 or 3 days a week, and you can collaborate together. That's part of our culture. So I think it worked.
Okay, so let's talk about pay. So obviously a topic that is of interest to me, and I know it's of interest to you as well, and something we worked together at Abcam. Actually, even at RSA, we worked on some pay stuff together.
Yep.
So there's been a lot of talk about pay transparency. It has been in the US for a few years now, with different states introducing their legislation. There's a lot going on now with the EU Transparency Directive, which is coming in June 2026, and that's going to, I think, completely change the way organizations have to manage pay. But what is your perspective on pay transparency, and how can companies balance the transparency element, but also being sensitive around, and again, this differs by cultures as well, around, privacy concerns. We know that some people, they will talk about pay, and they want to talk about pay. They will openly to do it. Others avoid having any conversations, and they feel like this is a very personal thing. They don't want to discuss it. So how do you balance that versus actually, I would say the vast majority of employees are seeking some level of transparency. There's different levels that they're seeking, but how do you, as an organization, approach this in a way that it's sensitive to all of these different concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's probably one of the fundamental things that builds trust in an organization is, am I fairly paid? And as I said, it's something we would be asking our people. But the piece of work that underpins this is actually the work that you did, Ramiz, back in 2016-17 with us, which was we went through and really worked to pull together job specs for every role, create job roles, job families, and then benchmark all of those roles in each of the markets in which we operated. So, we had hundreds of roles which we benchmarked, and we were unusual, and we often got kind of like, I guess, when you talk to some of the benchmark companies, they would be like, how many roles are you benchmarking? Because most organizations benchmark a couple and use that to create like some kind of pay structure. Whereas what we did was we said, if you're pick a role, senior scientist, and we will benchmark that role. We've got it defined. We'll match it. We did the matching work to match it into one of the structures within the benchmark organizations, and then we benchmark it into every market in which we operate and get the data on that. We then created a pay structure based around making sure we paid. If you're a fully performing person, you would be at the 100% mark of the benchmark. That was our aim on base pay. And then therefore, if you joined, you'd be at normally at the 75th, and then you could be up to 125th if you're like extra skills, extra performance. That was kind of structure. So in fact, we had probably about 400 pay grades around the world, because obviously some roles, like the role I've just talked about, we had lots of them, in China, in the US, in the UK, in Australia. But lots of people sat within there. But then you had somebody who was like SEO, search engine optimization specialist. We only had one, but we would benchmark that one role, and therefore you knew the data for that role. And then what we did is we put that put that data into our HCM system, our human capital management system, which was Oracle. Which has pros and cons. A lot of people maybe find that a little inflexible tool. But what it allowed us to do then was, through the pay reviews, is to allow leaders to see that data, and therefore they could make their pay decisions on an informed basis. So we didn't have a pay decision where you had a rating. We got rid of performance ratings. We thought they were ridiculous. What we did say to leaders is, you make a decision. You've got your team of people. You've got your pay budget based on the market movements in those markets and where people sit. But you can then make your decision on, I've got 10 people in my team. You know best who the best performers are, who the people, you can look at where they are in the position in the market, and then you make that pay decision rather than HR make it. Now, there was some auditing at the back end of that process to make sure we did some D&I sampling around making sure that groups weren't under or over index one way or another. We also made sure we looked at kind of by sites. We did all sorts of cuts, the reward team, to make sure that the system was operating. But at the core of it was trained managers making the right call, and then having an open conversation with their people about where they sat against the market. Now, that to me is total pay transparency. And some of the kind of legislation that's starting to appear around putting pay bands, particularly making them transparent, to me was a bit, we could have, and I said to our people, we can do that, but we'll be putting 400 pay bands out there. And you can do that for each of the sites you want to. But the most powerful conversation is a leader with their person about where they sit and what the pay decisions are around them. For me, that's why you then get that. And we were in the top 5th percentile in the comparative peer data in the employee survey in the Peakon, because you've got comparative data. We're in the top 5% on having the best reward conversations. And that to me, and on the top 5% on how people felt about pay. Now, ultimately, everybody always feels they're underpaid. That's just kind of consistent, unfortunately. But we were in the top 5% around how people felt about their base pay and how that was calculated.
I mean, that's again another amazing stat of being in the top 5%. But I'm probably not that surprised that you were in that list, because earlier you mentioned that one of the questions, for example, you asked in the survey was, are you having regular pay conversations, and are they good conversations? And that's one of the things that we find are the biggest challenge for organizations is, and I always say, when we introduce a new pay framework, employees are not going to come to HR to ask questions. They're going to go to their manager.
Yeah.
And we never give the managers any training on how to have pay conversations. And I think if you start to do that, for example, the way we approach it, it's, you have to first talk about why it's really important not to avoid pay conversations, because a lot of people avoid them because it's uncomfortable.
Yep.
Then there's all the things that you need to do in order to prepare for that conversation. Then it's, how do you build psychological safety when you have those conversations to make the other person feel safe,
Yep.
so they can talk about their concerns. And then you might want to go through, for example, different scenarios on, this is what they ask, this is what you say, or this is not what you say.
Yep.
So did you find that when you did your pay conversations training that had a massive impact, and how did you measure that impact that it had on your managers?
I mean, you're right. I mean, and I can't. I mean, in my fortunate now 30 years of working, I'd have, if I had £1 for every time HR people said, "Oh, if only leaders would have great conversations about pay, I'd be very, very wealthy." But actually, you invest in it. And what we chose to do when we revamped our performance management performance process, we changed from a 14-page document with ratings, which were very uninspiring. We got rid of the ratings. We went to a very simple performance, and we instead said you should have regular conversations with your people about performance, and therefore we called it performance with purpose. You talked about performance every time you had a one-to-one. You don't wait for an annual review. I mean, that's ridiculous. I mean, why save everything up to an annual review, normally linked to pay? So there's all this emotion swirling around. You actually just talk about it all the time. And if an individual wants to talk about their pay outside of the pay cycle, you can have that conversation because you've equipped leaders to be confident to talk about it. Now, it probably took us, if I'm honest, Ramiz, probably 2 or 3 years, even having trained people, to kind of get confidence up in having those conversations, because it is difficult. And it's not I mean, reward professionals really understand pay structures. HR professionals kind of half understand the pay structures and how they work, if we're honest. And then leaders, they're kind of, they used to be able to say, well, actually, you're rated as good. That's an HR rating. Unfortunately, that means you get this pay level. That's what they're used to saying. Suddenly saying, I made that decision, Ramiz, I made that decision on your pay because actually you're not as strong performing as some of your other colleagues, and you're actually better paid than them. That's quite a difficult conversation to have if you're not used to it. So I think it took us a good couple of years of that, looking at the data in the Peakon survey, in our survey every month, seeing where we were getting pockets. You could start to see the pockets where it wasn't working, going in and, giving extra support from the learning and development team to help with that. And we put money into that. We didn't train electronically, which is so easy to do and costs you, saves you money, but we actually put it into workshops. So we had 3 L&D people, 1 in each region, and they trained people. And then where we saw there was a need, we'd drop in and say, right, we need to do another workshop on pay in California, because clearly the conversations aren't working there. And the HR, head of HR, the HR partner for that area would go along and would be there to kind of support that as well. So it was a whole connected piece. And we'd often have the reward team come in and run like the technical part on, this is how we do reward and that as well. So you kind of ways of getting there, but it took a few years, if I'm honest. But actually then you have great conversations about it, and actually then leaders are accountable for their own decisions. And ultimately my logic was, I pay a leader to make that decision. I don't pay them to make decisions on multi-million-pound investments on equipment and so forth, but not allow them to make a pay decision. I mean, that's insane.
Yeah, no, definitely. It's so there's a lot going on with all of these different pay frameworks, conversations. around benefits, flexible working. And I know the other challenge that you had was that Abcam was a really high growth organization. Well, it's not necessarily a challenge. It's a quite nice thing as well.
It's nice, but it's still a challenge.
Yeah. Because it's not just organic growth. I think you had a lot of acquisitions as well.
Yep.
And I think all HR professionals know that acquisitions can be very challenging from a number of different perspectives, such as, the different HR systems, and we're always talking about TUPEing people across. And so what are some of the biggest HR challenges that you faced with the high growth and acquisitions, and what advice would you have for other HR people that are going through an acquisition on things to look out for?
Well, if I do acquisitions first, but then growth more, because there's organic growth as well as acquisitions. I mean, with acquisitions, it's being really clear about what's your purpose of the acquisition at the beginning. So am I buying it for the people? Am I buying it for the products? Am I buying it for the physical space? What's my purpose in buying this company? And therefore, that drives your plan. And I think a lot of organizations go and they're unclear. They just think, this has come up, we need it. And then, but if you're very clear on that at the beginning, then it drives your whole plan. And if you have a very clear plan on how you integrate, so ours was always, if this business is long-term with us, i.e. we're going to integrate those teams, and by long-term we meant over a year. So if it's going to be with us and those people are going to be with us for over a year, they would be fully integrated as a member of Abcam from the beginning of that acquisition. So we'd integrate them onto our benefits plans, we'd benchmark their roles, we'd adjust their pay straight away, and we put all of that into our planning, and when we were doing the due diligence on the business, we'd work that through. We'd also assess the culture of the business before we bought it and work out what's the cost of that integration. And we'd always put money into training people on some of the things we've just been talking about, having great conversations, performance management. Put all that into your costs of doing it. Lots of organizations leave it all out if you're going to integrate them. If you're not, and it's under 12 months, then we didn't integrate. And because it's very costly to do that, and if those people are not going to be with you over 12 months, and you're going to, you're really buying it for its products, then you wouldn't do that, and you would then drive really hard, treat those people really fairly, make sure they're incentivized to be around to see the transition through, but then make sure that you deliver on that on time. Otherwise, if you let it drag, they'll become demotivated very quickly, and they can see that two-tier approach. But if you're very open about it and say right at the beginning, which is what we would do, is say, hey, you're not here for the long term. We really want you to be around. This is how we're going to incentivize you. Then that would be, it's transparent and honest. And I think people appreciate that. Obviously, over time, you can 2 or 3 years down the road, you then start to think, actually, I've got too many sites. I perhaps want to do something different. That's a very different thing. That's not to do with your planning. That's just kind of in a high growth company, things change quite quickly. So sometimes you look at it and say, hey, 2 or 3 years down the line, why have we got 5 sites in the US? And we went through a rationalization. We were like, okay, we're going to go from 5 down to 2 because actually we could invest in one big site and actually then start to get benefits of scale. But that was certainly not the plan at the beginning. So I think always have a plan of, very clearly what is my purpose for buying that, and hence that drives your people plan and how you engage with people from the beginning. Other high growth, I mean, you've got to have a really amazing attraction strategy to drive high growth. And, most businesses struggle to get 4 or 5% growth, which is kind of above inflation. But, we were doing double digit, other than in the pandemic year, we were doing double digit growth. And you've really got to drive attraction strategies in all the markets you're in to make that happen. And I guess my big one, which is actually a reward-related one, was stock plan, share plans. We had some very attractive share plans, although we paid market rate on base pay, and we had some really interesting benefits, as we've just talked about, in things like family leave. Where we really differentiated ourselves was on stock plans, and we ran 2 different stock programs over a kind of 6-7 year period, which were very much driven on driving share ownership, stock ownership in our people. First one was a share matching plan, and that won awards at Geo and ProShare. That was kind of allowed people to buy shares, and then we matched by a factor of 10 for every share they bought if they stayed around and we hit some performance targets. And then the second share plan that replaced that was really a free share plan, and that was really driving share awards to all employees, and also then to some of our senior team as well, around driving growth in the business, and kind of gave both a long-term part to that and a shorter term, all of which were to degrees, and it's obviously complex in an acquisition, also then paid out at the acquisition when Danaher bought us at the end of last year. So it's a delight when kind of you could see the transformative effect that has on people, and our shareholders always fully supported us doing that with our people to make sure that their interests were aligned with our people. Up and down, they were really, when I talked to shareholders, they were always like, no, I don't even need to talk about that. Of course, yeah, do it, do more, do as much as you want to around shares. I mean, they're obviously more sensitive about senior people. It's slightly different, but frontline, yeah, get equity into the hands of your frontline people, please do. And in fact, even in the pandemic period, when we talked to them about the pandemic, our shareholders were like, protect your people. Whatever you do, protect them. They power your business. And I think organizations forget that, and they cost optimize their people, whereas actually, particularly in high growth worlds, they drive your growth. And I say that for me, stock programs, often underutilized, and in the UK follow a very dull standard format, quite often driven by the consultancy firms. But they're very dull and uninspiring, and based on share save and share incentive plans, which are not very significant. Ours didn't. Ours were consistent globally. They didn't take into account any tax benefits. They were driven to drive share ownership. That mindset we started talking with at the very beginning of this podcast. How do I have the mindset of an owner of the company? Well, you make them an owner of the company. And nothing makes me prouder that on the day of the acquisition, that our people, they had transformative amounts of money in their life, and to think that we created something which perhaps allowed people to buy their first home, or to pay off their student loans, or whatever it might be, that makes me massively proud of the effect that reward processes and policies can have on people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, I know we've talked about this in the past, and it's something that you're really proud of. And what about, because obviously that's a big mechanism that listed companies have to try and reward their people. Do you have any suggestions for organizations that don't have that tool? So private companies, for example.
Yep.
Have you ever worked in that environment, and what sort of things would you recommend there?
I've worked for a period privately owned. It was owned. I worked for a company called Motability Operations, which was owned by the banks as a partnership. But I guess you have to kind of create other mechanisms for people. So I think you start to think about variable pay, but aligning variable pay to business outcomes. And you need to make it substantial. I mean, I've worked in organizations, as you have, Ramiz, where people pay like tiny bonuses, and they spend a lot of time obsessing about a 4% bonus pot. And you're like, do you know what? Is that really going to shift the dial? It becomes like a profit share plan. It doesn't really drive performance. I think you have to make it, if you believe in it, then put the money behind it. And that can be cash from a private company. But you should set real targets that are about achieving that, and that's real business targets that you're going to achieve. And then when you achieve them, you all share the success of that. And how our share plans came about was actually we were inspired by a number of different things, but one of them was the John Lewis bonus plan, because they have this consistent idea that the percentage may vary by person, because of the percentage is the same by person, but the salaries are different because if you're the CEO, it's much higher salary. So, but everybody gets 20% when they're a success. Well, that's a great logic. It's very fair. And that's pretty much how we approached it, which was, let's make it fair, but not the same amount. So share save and share incentive plans are very unfair. But you can have a bonus plan where everybody gets, the potential is 20%. That's 20% if you're on £30,000 or dollars, or it could be 20% if you're on 200,000, and it's then related to your role, and therefore you get more if you're in a benchmark more senior role. So I think different things you can create, and organizations create phantom share plans and stock plans. I'm sure you and your team would be able to help people think about what they could do in those spaces, if they wanted to, and I've seen organizations do that as well.
Yeah, and I mean, so for example, what we have is a simple thing of a profit share, which is, like you said, it's if you do well as a company, then everyone shares in that success. And I think that's, again, you can, in any organization, create that sort of pot, which is based on the profit, and the more profit there is, the more people benefit from it. And I guess it's just, one of the things that you do need to balance with the John Lewis model that you mentioned of the 20% all the way to the top is the balance between retention, because the people at the senior end might think, I'll be able to get a lot more if I work elsewhere, because of the higher percentages at the higher levels. But I think, like you said, it comes down to what sort of culture you're looking to create. If it is a culture of, we don't want to do what everyone else is doing, simply because we want a more, we value internal equity more.
And I think, and you're right. I mean, so you might need to put in other things around more senior people, and we certainly did in some of ours. We had to kind of, because when you're benchmarking on whole package, total reward, and you'd fall away if you don't have that kind of thing in place. So you might need to do other things around more senior roles for sure. And I think you can think about that. But I think simplicity is that you've described in your own kind of profit share is important. I think, again, reward professionals, I've seen in different organizations, sometimes can make things incredibly complicated and use a language that nobody understands.
Yeah.
And then communicating it is a nightmare. And I know it's something you talk about a lot, is how you communicate these things, because if you don't communicate them in a way that people and employees understand, then you lose the benefit of all the money that you might be putting into these reward schemes. So, make it simple and then communicate it well. And, I think we certainly put a lot of effort into that. We did a lot of video work where we would film, fun ways of engaging people around plans. And obviously we had to run them through God knows how many lawyers and remuneration advisors before we ever released them. But they were much more engaging than very dry explanations. And then you back it up with, Teams calls where people could come, or face-to-face stuff where people could talk about it, or one-to-ones where people could talk to the reward team about their individual situation, and people could ask questions where they didn't feel stupid asking them in public. And you kind of have to have all of those things alongside it to make it successful. I think if you just come up with the scheme and then say, ta-da, there you go, and then give them a booklet which is impenetrable, and I've certainly had those in my time, and never appreciated the value of what it was, you've lost it. So, I think the work on communicating, simplicity in communications is probably important.
Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of this, we've probably heard me mention this before. There's a study by PayScale in the US where they surveyed these organizations where people were being paid below the market and their job satisfaction was 40%. And then they communicated to them and explained, for example, why they were being paid below the market. And then they did another survey and their job satisfaction went up to 82%. So they didn't have to pay anyone anything extra. It was purely the clear, simple communication and having, like you said, an adult to adult conversation just more than double their job satisfaction. So it is really a critical part, because you could have the best designed reward framework, but just not
Yep.
reap the benefits of it.
And I think that always standing in the shoes of the person on the other side was, I think, is the fundamental part. And there's in my team, there's a great partnership between our reward team and our internal communications team. And they would always, the internal communications team would always be the ones who'd be saying, "Can you explain that to me? So I can understand it." Because they would always be the kind of like trying to stand in their employee shoes, so that they could make sure, and when they're working with the reward team to take something out, that it really sold it in the way that was simple to understand and clear. And sometimes you have to put stuff in very legal, almost framework descriptions, particularly in a listed company when you're talking about stock plans, because there is some very legal wordings and people understand that. They know that's going to be there, but they need the explanation that explains it in human lay terms that you can understand. And at the same time, you're trying to educate people about it at the same point, because you're investing in this money to make sure that people really understand what it means to be a shareholder of the company. So you're trying a bit of education and explanation, and adult but simple, and that's quite a feat, I think, sometimes. And I just think having a very strong internal comms mindset and agenda around any initiative is is super critical to get the value out of.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, I think it's partly because reward people, we're so much into the detail, and we're always looking at the technical details. And I've been reading the EU directive and instructions
God
on
bless you.
gender neutral job evaluation schemes, and you just get into the detail, and you take for granted that other people don't necessarily recognize the same terms that you're using. So we actually have two people in our comms team now. So we speak to them and then say, okay, can you put this in language that's going to be simple for peers? So, for example, we might just use terms like upper quartile and lower quartile and say, well, we need to explain what that really means, because a lot of people might not know this. And I think it's just like you said, you need the two teams, the comms team and the reward HR teams, to be speaking to each other, so that you can really see if the comms team is not getting this, then everyone else is not going to be getting this.
Totally right. And I think it, again, under indexed, I think, because often reward teams would, in my previous lives, would write brochures for people, send them to them, and then you probably, even quite senior people, would not understand their stock programs because they and therefore the value was lost. And I think you just need to put investment into it, both in the routes to people. So thinking about stuff like video, because people engage better with that than booklets. But then thinking about all the routes, and then giving people an opportunity to have a dialogue about it as well, because sometimes they're just frightened to look stupid in front of their peers. And they've got inevitably, in a team of 10 people, there's one person that really understands this stuff. And then the other 9 are sat there thinking, I'm not really sure what this means, but don't want to say anything to look stupid. So you've also got to give people routes to have a dialogue with you as well, whether that's online chat, whether that's independent inboxes, whether that's having a one-to-one with somebody. And we often would open up and say, look, book in a one-to-one with the HR, with the reward team, and have a conversation. And they'd always be fully booked to have a conversation about things. And I can't tell you the number of times our reward leads would go and talk about pay benchmarking, or the stock programs, or variable pay, or benefits, because there was always an insatiable appetite in sites to know more about that. But that's we were very lucky. We had a very inquisitive, scientific, analytical team of people who always wanted to know more and make sure they understood it. I mean, we had a senior leader once who said, I want to go through the methodology that sits behind the pay benchmarking system that we had. So testing out your work remies for you. And because they wanted to make sure that it was scientifically robust, what we did. And they did, and they would obviously, kudos, it was absolutely robust, of course. And but then they became the greatest advocate for it. And because they just needed to understand it. And then once they understood it and they realized it wasn't sort of HR reward jiggery pokery going on in the background and telling them rubbish. It was the data. They could see the raw data from the survey, and we explained that, and they could see it. They were like, all right, I understand that now. Okay, well, great. I'm going to go talk to my team about it. It's I think you just got to work your way through all these things, haven't you? And but I say underestimated in HR and reward circles is that comms activity. I think underinvested in.
Definitely. Let's look at the future of HR, and there's two topics I wanted to ask you about. One is the increasing use of AI, and we've seen. I think I was reading something around. Something like 55% of HR managers are expected to be using AI, at least part of the recruitment process in the next 5 years. And then the other is around multi-generational workforces. And again, when we look at pay, for example, we've seen there's very different feelings around pay transparency with Gen Z employees who are a lot more open to discussing pay in the workplace. They are also the first generation that, based on research, say that they would be willing to compromise on pay if it means instead working in an environment where they feel a sense of, making a difference or belonging. So it's very different. Obviously, within generations, there's lots of differences, but these are generalizations. But with these different generational preferences, it's the same when it comes to benefit. There are different preferences as well. Was this one of the challenges that you faced at Abcam, or did you look at the different generations, or was it very much we think this is the right thing to do and people will embrace it?
Great, two great questions, Ramiz. I'll start with the AI one then. I think let's remember there's always people. So AI is a tool to help, but there's always people at the end of a business. I mean, in some businesses maybe will become completely AI without people, but generally there are people involved. So and smarter AI becomes the better and easier it is to engage with the technology, because I think it becomes a bit more real than at the moment. And I think at the moment it's still quite clunky, but I think there's some brilliant tools out there. And certainly if I take and I should get paid by Peakon and Workday for advocating for the product. But as I've said, there are other products that people may choose. But one of the things it did brilliantly was analyze the comments in each leader's areas and the scores, and then recommend training for people, and then provided that training for them, like bite-sized learning that you could do on the back of what was coming out of the analysis on your engagement. So if, I don't know, strategy and communication were coming up as an area that needed focus, there below you would be a module that you could do in 10 minutes that gave you some really easy stuff to do on how you address that. That's smart AI for me. I think some of the recruitment stuff, gets pretty mixed reviews at the moment, and I'm slightly nervous about the bias that comes into that. That gets built into some of these, and I've seen quite a few research papers around some of the bias that's coming through because it's based on learned and existing populations, which means it could be reinforcing things. So I think it's got a way to come, but I think as long as we're using the tools to help us do smart things, then I think it's helpful. We'll see how it comes out over the next 5 or 10 years, and I'm always slightly nervous when people like Elon Musk are involved in driving some of the standards that may happen there, because that's not going to be driven for the benefits of all of us. Unfortunately, they're for people's own benefits. So then, sorry, the second one I've now forgotten, which is showing my. It
was the multi-generational.
Multi-generational, absolutely. So that's a brilliant question. And did we do stuff? Yes, we did some work on personas around really trying to understand the people in our organization and the different generations and the different kinds of people. And I'm always slightly nervous about putting people in a box because we're all individuals. And I always used to say we had 1,700 individual talented people, but we started to look at our personas within the organization to help us make sure we were meeting the needs rather than doing one size fits all. We could start to think about how you engage with people from the different type of personas, and there were some distinct age groupings, like sub 35-year-olds, kind of the Gen Zs, as it were, through to kind of people at the more mature end, like myself. And really working out what could you do to engage with them and about things. And we started to use some of that to help us think about adding more things and more choice for people, not targeting people, but just opening the choice of things that you could do and allowing you to make those choices on things that were important in your life. And having a great workplace that's fair, gives you room to grow, that rewards you fairly, that has great conversations, you can share in the success of the company. That's all generations want that.
Yeah.
But you could start to say, okay, what can we make sure? And we're adding in, and actually we were probably over-indexed on having a sub 35-year-old population in the organization. So actually had a lot of Gen Zs. We also had to make sure we were doing things to engage with our more mature employees, and we were attracting them into the marketplace actually as much, if not more, in fact, because actually you have to work out, how do I actually try and attract and retain people who are could have some amazing experience to bring into the organization, not only those who are kind of fresh out of college or university and growing them. And there's not lots of great practice out there, and I talked to people in some of the big tech companies. They were brilliant at focusing on people in their 20s and giving them things that were amazing. So, you go to organizations, you can see people with, pizzas and beers to have them be there all the hours that they work. But actually, when they started to come through to having kids and stuff, they weren't as focused on them. And they certainly weren't focused on people who are in their maybe in their 50s and above. And I think we tried to start to think about, what do we need for those, what are those populations needing, and how do we kind of add them to, rather than take things away. We actually give them to people, and even start to think about, do we communicate with them slightly differently? Because actually you started to see that the personas we had, if you communicated a training program differently to the different populations, actually you could see different take-ups for people. So if you actually started to say to our younger population, it's about owning your own career, you've got your future, you make your choices, they would sign up for it. If you said that to more mature people, they wouldn't. But if you said to them, this is about your plan, this is about the future, this is about maximizing your return and the skills that you have, and making sure that you're keeping them up to date, they would sign up. Same program, but you might communicate them differently. So that's how we started to look at it. But I think a lot of the research indexes towards the Gen Z. I think you just got to make sure you don't only do that. You actually think about the whole population, and we're going to need more people working through to their 60s and 70s, as much as we need young people coming into the workforce as well.
Okay, that's really interesting. Around, it's not necessarily, what you're saying is, it's not necessarily just what you're offering to the different generations, but we have to think about how we communicate to them. And it's not that doesn't mean videos to one and brochures to another, but it's the language and the messages that you use.
That's right. I think it's really understanding those populations and then starting to weave that into your communications. And it may be you have one communication that goes to all employees, but you weave in the messages you need, knowing what turns the mind on of the different populations you're pushing for. And if you put that into the communications, you'll find you'll get different engagement around it. So I think it's being sophisticated. If you just bucket people, and I would never ever bucket somebody, I hate bucketing people. I think it's wrong. And say, well, Nick, you are definitely in that more mature group, you're going to get this. That just is wrong, because that is doesn't help. I think if you say, these are some things you might be interested in, but open up to everybody, then I think it allows freedom of choice for you as an individual to engage with the things that you want to engage in, really.
Okay.
That sits at my heart of a lot of things I believe in is freedom of choice. And each individual should make their own choices in life. You give them as much information as possible, and then let them make their own calls. They're adults. I always remember this. We think about employees. We're all an employee of some kind, and we make choices in our life. I go out and decide what car I'm going to buy. I decide where I'm going to live. But then in the workplace, we kind of start to treat people like children and restrict their choice. And I think that's just, we should be allowing them set them free within their framework to make choices about what benefits I want, how I come to work, where I work, how I do my job. As long as I achieve the outputs, surely we should give people as much freedom of choice as possible.
Yeah, I completely agree, because I have a similar view on when people ask me about pay transparency, and they say, well, should we be publishing everyone's salary? Because there are some companies like Buffer that have gone and done this. And
Yep.
I always think, as an organization, we should be publishing all of the context around how we make pay decisions and why we manage pay the way we do. And we're saying we have nothing to hide, and then leave it up to the employee and give them the choice that if you want to discuss pay with everyone and give your salary, it's completely up to you, but we have nothing to hide. So it's not really a choice that we should make on their behalf and share their salary with everyone.
I totally agree with you. And, some people may feel they don't want that. Because there's this drive which some people want to share everything. Well, that's great, but there are a lot of people who don't, who see it very much that it's their private information and they do not want that information shared. And, I think that's that's as equally a valid choice, and we should respect that. And but I think it's about having all the data available, having equipped leaders, having great, transparent, honest conversations. That's at the heart of it, not great HR things which are posted on a website and actually does not help drive true transparency and fairness. Because ultimately, what the transparency is trying to drive is a fair pay system, and that's what there should be, is fair pay.
So you've had a very successful career over 30 years.
Yes.
And
obviously, I look like I'm in my 30s still. Rameez, is what you were going to say.
Yeah. I only mentioned the 30 because you mentioned it first.
No, you're right. So... I did. You didn't age shame me or anything. I'm not calling you out for that. You're okay.
So what advice would you have for someone who's, let's say, starting out their career, or they're early on in their career, but they have this aspiration to become an HR director one day?
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I think two things. One is constantly try and learn new things. So wherever you are, don't get in a rut. Go out, try and find other things you don't know. Go into other bits of the business that you don't, you kind of don't understand. Go and ask them if you can job swap for a month. Go and try and really understand what's going on and what might inspire you about the future. Which leads me to my second thing, which I think is I've certainly learned, and I learned when I came to Abcam, probably most. I'm a slow learner. It took me probably 20 odd years to learn this. Was do the things you've always wanted to do, not what you've always done. And it's quite hard if you're in a more junior position to do that, but I still think you have a lot of freedom in roles to do things, but quite often we just do what we've always done. And my share plan example would be I can remember the moment where my boss, our CEO, said we really need to think about what's next for stock plans. And I sat there and I thought about SIP and I thought about ShareSave, and my heart sank because I was like, oh God, I'm so bored with them. But then I thought about what I wanted to do. And that actually was the first share plan we had was called A Crazy Idea. And actually, when I took it to the board, it was called A Crazy Idea. We couldn't put that on the board paper because apparently that wouldn't look good from a corporate governance point of view. But it was called A Crazy Idea. But the crazy idea I just wanted to do. And I don't think we often do it. We just get conditioned into doing what we've always done or what everybody else has always done. And I just say, do things you really want to do. And even if it's difficult or challenging to make that happen, do that, but you've got to have the experience to allow you to do that. So I don't say just do it from without. I think you have to go out, learn lots of things, and then allow yourself the freedom and the confidence in your own judgment to say, well, this is what I really want to do. Why don't we do it? And then see what people say. And you'll find actually most of the time people say, yeah, I love it. Why don't you do that? And when you helped us with the pay benchmarking, we'd never benchmarked a role other than the CEO and CFO before in the company. And at the time, it's kind of quite a crazy idea to benchmark every single job in the company in every market in which you operate. But it was, the thing I certainly believed in fairness, and that was fair to do that. So, yeah, that's probably my 2 bits of advice.
Oh, great, thanks. And as we come to the end, I know in some podcasts they may have asked you what your favorite book is, but that's not the question that I ask. My question is, what is your favorite film?
So I was tipped off to this. So thank you, Sarah. So yeah, I've got two. I'm going to be cheeky and say two.
Okay.
One I just love because I think it's one of the most amazing films I've ever seen, and that is the most amazing film called Brief Encounter, filmed around the Second World War. So it's black and white. It's an old Coward film. It's absolutely the most beautiful film, and got so many emotions running through it in a very British way. I just think it's wonderful film, and I never get bored watching that film. So if anybody hasn't seen it, get it on DVD or get it online. I'm not sure if you can get it on the BFI website or something, but it's definitely worth seeing. Just incredible.
I haven't seen
acting.
that one actually, so I'm going to add that to my list.
Seeing it. And the other one, which is slightly more at the other end of kind of cheesy films, is Pretty Woman, which I just think is a joyful, fun film. I love cars, so I love the Lotus at the beginning. I think the acting is just incredible. And I think you've got two amazing actors doing a really different film. They took a massive risk in making that movie. And in fact, on the car is a fun story, is that they asked Porsche to provide a car for the movie, and Porsche said no, and all the other manufacturers said no. We don't want our film associated with prostitutes. And actually Lotus, who were a very unknown company, supplied a car because they were unknown, and that's why the car got placed into the movie. So I think it's kind of that slightly risky film that became a true love film of a lot of people, and I think I love it for that. The fact it's slightly irreverent and just a beautiful story out of something which is quite seedy at the beginning. So I love it. Those are my two.
Ah, great. No, and I, because I love films, and in my book I reference them throughout, and I love anecdotes like this around little stories like the Lotus one that you mentioned.
Yeah.
And do you know if that helped the company?
Yeah,
in any way?
It did. Lotus has always struggled. If you ever read about it, the company's had a real struggle through its life. It's struggled to make money. It's having a little bit of a rebirth now, but it did help. It brought a load of sales into the US on the back of it. An interesting little side story is that car came up for sale, I can't remember, about 5 or 6 years ago, and I was so tempted. I didn't have enough money for it at the time, but it wasn't that much. To have bought the car, the Pretty Woman car, would have been amazing. It got bought by a museum somewhere in the US in the end, but I was half tempted to go into the auction to try and buy it. But it's if you watch it, it became a fundamental part of the movie because, of course, he struggled to drive the car because it was a manual, a stick shift, as they'd say in the US. And that was her kind of magic, was that she knew all about this slightly quirky British car that ended up in the middle of this movie. So, and plays a fundamental part of the story. So it is fun. I'm like you. I love an anecdote like that.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot, Nick, for all of your advice, insights, and sharing your experience. And I look forward to hearing about what challenge you decide to take on next.
Thank you, Ramiz, and thank you, the people listening. And if anybody wants to connect with me, check me out on LinkedIn, drop me a note, say hi, and good luck and have fun. Come up with some crazy ideas, everyone.
Yeah, yeah, great advice to end it on, and we will share Nick's LinkedIn profile in the podcast notes as well, so you can connect with him. Thanks again, Nick, and speak to you at the next episode of A Case of the Mondays.
You've been listening to A Case of the Mondays. Feel free to share this episode with anyone you think might find it useful. Similarly, if you have any questions about what we've discussed today or would like to suggest a topic for future episodes, get in touch by emailing podcast@3r-strategy.com or head over to 3r-strategy.com to sign up to our mailing list for regular news and updates.